Putting Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. As you will hear in this episode, I think I might have a problem in that I have a bias against Cinderella. That makes it sound worse than it actually is. It's not like I don't like her or I don't like the performers that have performed her. It's not even that I don't like the character, but for whatever reason within this show, I think I'm an anomaly in that I often forget about her journey throughout this show, whereas others find her to be one of the more engaging characters in Into the Woods. But for me, it's always been the baker's wife, who I've been excited to see how her journey ultimately culminates. But as you'll hear in this episode, Christine Chen has returned to offer some great insights into the character, how it works throughout the show, and why this song, at least dramaturgically, is so essential to the success of the show. Anyway, this is a bit of a longer episode here this week, so we might as well just jump right into it. Here's my conversation with Christine Chen about A Very Nice Prince.
He's a very nice prince, and it's a very nice ball, and when I end
Christine Chen, thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you so much. You know, ever since I was first on this podcast, I've been waiting for Into the Woods. So this is the one that I've been the most excited for.
Just counting down
I'm
the
so
days.
glad I got the invite.
Yeah, no, this is going to be real fun. This is Into the Woods, of course. I say we just jump right in and just ask the question of when was the first time you were introduced to this show?
So this was my first Sondheim show that I was fully aware of it being a Sondheim show. I think I had come across it from, if people still listen to Pandora, it's like internet radio and you can like make a based off of one song or genre or whatever. And I had like a whole Broadway cast albums thing. And one of the songs came up. It must have been like the prologue or something. That was, a pretty wild choice. But I remember hearing about all the different fairy tales and I was like, oh, like I love fairy tale remixes and like all the different retellings. And so I looked it up, discovered what it was about. I think I listened through it first. Weirdly, like the score at first was, I was an Andrew Lloyd Webber kid. So I was like, this score's whatever.
Yeah.
Like it's not that like huge melody sort of thing. And then I just remember like I have this very vivid memory of like I was playing golf in high school and I just had It Takes Two stuck in my head as I was like trudging through the woods of like this golf course. And I was
funny.
like, okay, maybe this score has something to do with it. So I actually like took a deeper dive in. And also it happened to be at the time I grew up in San Diego, and the Old Globe Theater, which is where the original Into the Woods premiered, was doing a production of Into the Woods at the time in 2014, which was actually the Fiasco Theater production. It was like, I guess their pre-off-Broadway run of that production. So I saw that, and that I think was where I like truly fell in love with Into the Woods. And I was like, oh my God, this show is incredible. And then I discovered the PBS recording later, actually. So I hadn't been exposed to that as much yet. But yeah, I love this show. Like whenever people ask me favorite musicals, like it's interesting because it, like I used to always say Into the Woods, and then it got to the point where I was like, oh, like, I don't know, I've just been saying Into the Woods, do I really like it? And then every time I listen to it again, I'm like, wait, this is actually still really good. So
it's so hard because, you get into these specific fandoms and certain things are looked on as like basic or not basic.
Yeah.
Up until maybe the Disney film that they made out of this back in 2012. I would say that for like, I don't know, non-musical people, Into the Woods would still be somewhat like obscure. Whereas if you're a Sondheim fan, this is kind of like the most basic one to be like, yeah, that's my favorite. Which I totally own that. I was like, yeah, it was like my first one I really deeply fell in love with. And there might be specific songs or scores that technically I like better, but this is always the one I keep coming back to. It's the one I've listened to the most from start to finish all the time. So one aspect I just wanted to bring, this has not come up yet on this show, and I'm going to do another thing that's going to be so obscure that no one is probably going to know what I'm talking about. I think there was a part of me that was primed to like this. I got into the Woods before, I would say, a lot of the more other like fairy tale remixes had happened. Like it was before I knew about Ella Enchanted or Shrek or any of that stuff had really come out or been published or anything like that. There was, God, this is so niche. Okay, so there's these old Canadian comedy duo called Wayne and Schuster. Their claim to fame is that they appeared the most times on the Ed Sullivan Show. I'm not old enough to have watched the Ed Sullivan Show, but that is their claim to fame. Anyways, when I was growing up, they're so old, but they were still doing like these comedy specials every so often on the CBC. And we taped off of television this thing called Once Upon a Giant. And it was them. One was like a jester, one was like the court physician, and they go on this adventure meeting all the different fairy tale characters like Little Red Riding Hood, et cetera, as they go through their own little fairy tale thing. It's also a musical, and you can also watch the whole thing on YouTube. Someone has uploaded it, so you can actually watch the whole thing. And I don't think the music is actually that bad. There's actually some pretty fun lyrics and tunes and stuff in it.
Lassie goes with laddie.
Sometimes mommy goes with daddy.
In Shakespeare, nothing goes with much ado.
The spoils go with the victor.
Boa with constrictor. And I'm with you.
I will not say if the comedy holds up anymore. Probably doesn't, but the music still works. And so that's, I think when I was coming into it was like, oh, it's like Once Upon a Giant. It's like this thing that I was already kind of like in love with that I had watched so many times. And now it almost feels like this is like a huge trope of like, well, it's the fairy tale, but we're going to be like, it's like the subversive version of the fairy tales or something like that. It's happened so many times now that it doesn't really feel original.
I feel like also a lot of it now is a lot more like, I think Shrek probably started this trend where a lot more is just more cynical or like, oh, well, like, how are we going to take down this fairy tale? And actually, this is my like niche story now. So I used to go to a theater summer camp when I was really young. And just to be clear, it is nowhere near the level of like the movie that Ben Platt and Molly Gordon were in. This was like a very chill, camp, like, here are some things that you can do to occupy your time. But we would put on like a small scale production at the end of each year. And one year, our camp counselor actually wrote a play. His name is Graham Russo. So wherever you are, like, you know, this is still ingrained in my mind. He called it The Last Days of the Wolf. And it's about like from the wolf's perspective, like there's a family of wolves. Each wolf is a different wolf in the fairy tales. Like we had 3 little pigs, we had Little Red Riding Hood. And it was like a very sympathetic look towards the wolf side. And it was sort of like, can we afford to stay in these woods like any longer? It's very Anatevska at the end. And that was like, I was like, whoa, like you're combining different things, like drawing upon this shared history, you know, so that was what I like had first thought of when I heard about Into the Woods and how like everything was getting combined together. But yeah, like now it's just like, I think the way that people look at fairy tales is very different. And also at the time, like the TV show Once Upon a Time was also airing. I was also really into that. I thought the first season was incredible at how they combined different fairy tales, and it sort of went off the rails a little after that. But you know, as TV shows tend to do. But
yeah, you know. I think that is something that is very key, and in my personal opinion, probably why this show, of any of the Sondheim shows, gets put on so many times, is that there's certainly elements of this they can become pessimistic, but it never becomes cynical. I think it's actually fairly optimistic at the end of this. And like the classic Sondheim thing of being like kind of bittersweet and sad, I guess. But it never turns into like everything sucks. Like that's really not the outlook of the show by the end of it.
You can tell that they liked fairy tales. Like they were like fascinated by them and they were interested in sort of expanding upon them. Like, you know, what happens next and like, why did this happen? But it wasn't like, oh, let's take down fairy tales as an institution and like, you know, these are dumb or anything.
This is such a key thing. This is also, I've brought this up a couple of times, why I don't have a lot of patience for most of the musicals that are like, we're a send up of other musicals. Because by the halfway point of like, do you like musicals though? Like it always feels like, aren't musicals dumb and stupid? And isn't it stupid that people like them? I'm like, well, I do like them. So stop doing this.
Yeah, it's a really fine line to draw with like, oh, are you like parroting it in a loving way, or are you just look at how dumb it is that people are singing and dancing?
Yeah, so stop doing that, everyone. So Into the Woods, kind of your first Sondheim musical that you understood, like, this is like the Stephen Sondheim guy, and kind of embraced it, loved it. Did you watch the PBS version then? Like, did you actually get the DVD copy, or did you watch that online?
I watched the YouTube version. Yeah. Okay. So it was just there because I think I was just after I had seen it in person, I was like, oh, like, let me see what other clips I can find of it. And I found out that the whole show was there. And I was
Right.
like, oh, okay, that's great. So yeah.
It is always a bonus when I'm searching for a clip. I'm like, oh, someone's actually uploaded the whole thing. This is
Exactly.
this worked out really, really well. How many, can you remember, I guess, how many versions of Into the Woods have you actually seen?
So actual versions that I've seen is technically only 2,
Okay.
but I have seen the show 5 times. So I saw that first time at the Old Globe, and then later that same Fiasco production toured like many years later.
Right.
And I ended up seeing that because it was coming to LA where I was at the time. And then I saw the City Center version, which became the off-Broadway or became the Broadway revival in last
Sarah
year.
Bareilles,
So so I saw it at City Center. At that time, Neil Patrick Harris playing the Baker, and there are a few other cast differences. Saw the revival when it like first showed, and then I saw the second round cast of that revival as well with Stephanie J. Block, and there are a few other cast changes and stuff.
Okay, well, technically then, I guess if we're just going to go for in person, we've seen the same amount because I saw a regional production where I live. That was like my formative experience back when I was a teenager. I saw the Broadway revival only with Stephanie J. Block and as the Baker's wife. Did not get to see the previous version. But then, I've seen obviously the PBS version.
Right.
I've seen is it Regent Park? Whatever, the London version, or a fairly recent London version that's also on YouTube that people can go and watch. And then the movie version. So that's
I've seen them. I used to be like kind of a movie apologist for this, but then I like once I grew older and like sort of realized how many more themes there were in the show, I was like, okay, the movie does kind of get rid of all of them. The movie, I'm trying to refrain from just bagging on it because I will say this. There are actually some elements to that movie that I think are actually very well done. Unfortunately, I think it is made by people who fundamentally don't understand what makes Into the Woods work. Yeah, I agree. It annoys me a lot. My thesis statement for the movie is that Into the Woods is not a show that works on film. Unless you play with the sort of staged version of it. Like if they had made the film like the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat film where it's like basically staged but like on sound stages, like I think it could have worked that way. But you need the sort of like direct address to the audience in a certain aspect, and you need like because it's about telling a story and the stories that we tell children. Right. So like if you take that away in the movie, I still think the movie does an admirable job with what the direction was and with like all the pieces are there, but they just like it just sort of lost a lot of what made the heart and soul of the show. We'll eventually get to this song in this season. The one song I think that is actually a home run that they actually do something really visually interesting with it is On the Steps of the Palace. I actually think that song has done such a great job of translating that idea into a film. It's like, oh man, if the rest of the movie could be like this, this would be kind of great. Hey everyone, just Kyle breaking into the conversation to tell you about some of the people that help this show continue to go. If you'd like to help support the show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review in whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's, of course, greatly appreciated. Putting It Together is an independent podcast, so if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. But I do need to give a shout out to our newest patron from over there. Robin signed up as a new $5 patron. So thank you so much, Robin. It does go a long way to help making this show be somewhat self-sustainable within my ever increasingly busy life. But I also need to give a huge thank you to the God That's Good tier from Patreon of Barry, Derek, Alex, Christopher G, Christopher L, Jack, Luis, Mike, Robert, Stephen, Todd, and Whitty. Thank you so much for helping support me, and let's get back to the show. To that end, what song are we talking about here today? And we are talking about another Cinderella song, which is A Very Nice Prince.
That's right. There's a few things before we jump into it. This is a very short song, to be brutally honest here, but I think it actually is important to understand some of the characters around it. I guess first, if you can remember, what is happening in the show right before this song shows up the first time?
it depends who you're looking at, but like Jack just gets berated by his mom for selling Milky White for some beans. Right before that, Little Red just has her awakening. She
Right.
sings I Know Things Now. And obviously, around this whole story, the baker and the baker's wife are looking for their 4 items. The baker's wife has Milky White with her when she runs into Cinderella coming back from the ball.
Absolutely. So yeah, there's a bunch of, well, I guess we'll call them shenanigans that are going on in the woods right now. So different storylines are crossing over with one another, and we see Cinderella kind of running away from the palace on the first night. If people can recall, in the original Grimm's version of the Cinderella fairy tale, she goes to the ball 3 times. It's like a little festival, so it's going up for 3 nights, and each night she runs away from the prince. So this is her first night running away from the prince. And if people know the song First Midnight, this is really leading right into First Midnight. Like, it basically, the end chorus kind of like leap right into that song. So that being said, we have discussed Cinderella a little bit on this podcast already, but maybe you can add in your perspective of the Cinderella character. Because I believe she is important, like super important to this show.
Right.
I guess I'll only speak for myself. She's often the character I kind of forget about. For large portions of this show, for some weird reason. Like, I always think of this as the baker's wife show. Like, that's always who I'm thinking of when I think of this show.
I mean, my hot take is that I think Cinderella is a more interesting character than the baker's wife. I think that because, I mean, you've talked on this show about how the baker's wife and the baker are supposed to be like suburban or like Brooklyn transplants,
That's
whatever,
what
from the modern time. But I think like and don't get me wrong, the baker's wife is a very interesting character. Like, you can act that character in so many different ways. But I think what's interesting about Cinderella is she doesn't know who she is. And over the course of the show, that's like kind of one of her goals, is to like, or not necessarily goals, but like that's what her character arc is to like figure out who she is and sort of explore the world that she's in and discover how that it's another growing up metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I think the baker's wife, it's like she knows who she is, she knows what she wants, and like maybe that gets a little hazy in the second act, but she still has like a very core understanding of what her purpose is and what she is trying to get out of life. So that's why I think like Cinderella is actually slightly more interesting to me. And, you know, the whole like running from the prince every time, and like the prince doesn't understand it. Sondheim originally was like, why is she doing that? That's why they wrote on the steps of the palace and everything. And so I think that, and also just like the way that they enter into these fairy tales, I think is interesting, where it's like, once upon a time, here are these 3 characters. And it's like, oh, so has the witch just been living next door to them? And then she randomly decides to tell them about this curse on the same day that Cinderella happens to need to go into the woods for the festival. And like, why did you choose today instead of every other day? And the reason is Lapine needed them to all be in the woods on the same day.
Yeah, right.
But I think it's also just sort of like, you can take a look at sort of the meta narrative of like, fairy tales don't, like the fairy tale characters don't exist until we need them to exist.
Right.
So in a way, talking about Cinderella's backstory is almost non-productive, because you just need to know that she was raised with stepmother and stepsisters. Like, she doesn't know what she wants because she has no backstory, and she has no like we don't, in this show, we don't even know like how old she was when her mother died. We don't know how long she's been living under the thumb of her stepmother. We just get these little snapshots. And even you can see this in Cinderella in the Grave. If you look like at the PBS recording when she's like, oh, like, you know, I've been good and I've been kind, tell me what to do. And the mom looks almost like exasperated. She's like, give me a specific wish. Like, what do you wish?
Tell me
figure
what
it
you
out.
want.
You know, like,
there's actually a lot to dig in there. But I mean, just talking about like the fairy tale nature of this, right? Fairy tales definitely evolved at a time where the way stories were told is just fundamentally different than I think what a modern contemporary audience expects of it. Even stretching back 40 years when this show came out, where we kind of want that 3-act structure, that hero's journey, if we want to get like English analysis and stuff like that on top of this. When the fact of the matter is, way back when, like going back centuries, and how stories were often told, like that kind of stuff just didn't matter. They didn't need the character to grow or even necessarily even to learn anything. It was more like, what is the reader learning from this? What is like the lesson to glean from this? And basically, as soon as it comes to the end, it's like, yep, they lived happily ever after and they cease to exist. We don't ever have to learn about the hardships or the struggles they went through, because it doesn't matter that they cease to exist after this story ends. That being said, obviously Sondheim and Lapine are not going to just think that way and have them exist that way. They want to delve into like what happens after the happily ever after, and they want to make sure that these feel like three-dimensional real characters. And I think you're hitting on something really important. I think that what makes the Cinderella character really work is she is a character that can't make a choice. She can't actually make a decision, and she can't even verbalize how to make a decision, which I think is interesting in two aspects in this show. One, the baker's wife, who she's interacting with in this scene, is literally the exact opposite.
Yeah.
The baker's wife is like, this is what I want, I'm going to go and get it. And Cinderella's like, I don't know what I want, and I don't know how to get in, like, to find out what I want, sort of thing. It's kind of the difference between what I've been told, at least, anxiety versus depression, which is like, anxiety is feeling like you have too many choices and you can't like figure out what it is that you should choose. Whereas depression is like, you know, the thing that's making you sad and you just are sad. Like there's an absence of something in your life that you want to go and fill.
Well, to add on to that, the other thing that I've heard about the comparison between anxiety and depression is anxiety is you're always looking forward and you're always like paralyzed by the thought of the future. Whereas depression, you're sort of like always looking backward and paralyzed by like what happened in the past. And so neither one, you're sort of really like living in the present. Yeah. Which I think could also be sort of applied to these two characters as well.
100%. And I also find it interesting then, I guess I maybe you won't agree with this, but I feel that the show is trying to communicate that the baker and Cinderella end up together at the end of this. I mean, that's never verbally, I don't think, like...
Well, it's like the straight version of a queer platonic relationship, right?
Yeah.
And like whether or not they romantically end up together is like beyond the scope of the show. It's not important. But, you know, like I think you've listened to Ben Rimmelauer's podcast, Giants in the Sky, where he talks to Lapine. And I think from the beginning, I don't remember if it was Lapine that said this or someone else, but they were like, this was always the intention. That's why they sing the Into the Woods parts together in the prologue. And I thought that was interesting as well, because, you know, Cinderella, the classic Cinderella story is that her main character trait is she's kind, like always be kind and things will come to you.
Right.
And so that's sort of like what Cinderella grapples with throughout the show as well, and especially in the prologue. And I think arguably the baker is the kindest person in the show. Like he's not perfect, but I think compared to everyone else, like he is pretty kind to people. And like he stole the cloak from Little Red, she started crying, he immediately gave it back. And, right. So, and he felt bad for Jack, you know, so it's like I think it makes sense that she sort of like ends up with him, and it's like a sort of in between of both her father's house and the prince, and like, you know, she's like, I want something in between. I think it makes sense.
I also want to say, this is me being vulnerable for a second here, because I can't believe I've never picked up on this over like nearly 20 years, or maybe just over 20 years now, of listening to this score and feeling like I knew it very, very well. I don't know how much more of a signpost, like this is basically a neon sign that they're pointing at this with, and yet this is the week I find like, oh, this is kind of interesting that they did it this way, obviously intentionally. Whereas we have just finished a song whose button is basically nice is different than good. And we followed up with a song called A Very Nice Prince. So it's like, I don't know how more obvious you can be with this. And you're like, oh, they're saying that the prince is nice, but not necessarily good. And
that definitely comes into play later too.
Yeah, 100%. So anything else you wanted to say about like the baker's wife?
I think it's interesting that she is the one that is like more interested in the prince. Like everyone else doesn't seem to care about him. And I think if we sort of extrapolate on the fact that she is the idea of like a modern woman, we tell ourselves these stories because we like the idea, and like historically people like the idea that they could, you know, end up with a prince. Like Americans famously obsessed with British monarchy, like the prince, the royal wedding, all of that. Cinderella could not give a shit. Like she is just like, I just wanted to go to the festival. Now there's this guy who has been chasing me through the woods. And even though she's the one that's like predestined to end up with him, she does not care about royalty. Like she might think it's nice, but like not in the way that the baker's wife is like, oh my God, he's the prince. And she's just like, yeah, I danced with him. Like what? So I think that is an interesting way that the
Yeah.
baker's wife also taps into like our consciousness and like how we would act towards something like this.
I think it's like such a great encapsulation or like a great showing of like the difference between people who are so obsessed with celebrity versus, I'll just say, like normal people. I fall into this. I'm not going to say I'm above this, but you know, you can run into people like who know like every small detail about like their favorite celebrity. I'm like, I don't care. Like they're a person who's like in a movie. Like it doesn't really affect me in any conceivable way. So to see that kind of inside of this show too is kind of fun to see. It's like, tell me everything about this prince. I'm like, he's a prince. I don't know. He does stuff. He looks nice.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing about the baker's wife that's interesting is just like how an actor chooses to portray their relationship between the baker and the baker's wife.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the first time I saw the PBS recording, I thought Joanna Gleason came off a little like cold gives the wrong connotation, but it's like she wasn't warm necessarily.
Yeah,
and I think
that.
It's because she has that sort of like sardonic flair. She's very independent. And I think for the longest, I like wasn't convinced they wanted this baby because they wanted to be parents. I think it felt more like that's just what you're supposed to do in these types of fairy tales. You're supposed to want a child. And like, you know, how else are we going to have a chance to go on this quest? She almost seemed too cool to be a parent to me in that recording.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's just, now that you said that, like I can totally see that reading. I don't even know if that's wrong necessarily. Like I think you could play the baker's wife like explicitly that way, where it's like, I want this baby. I actually don't really care if it's with you or not. I just want a baby because that's gonna, I think, make my life better, sort of thing.
Yeah.
I will say the only thing I will I guess offer is I think the wrong way to go about it is like outward contempt. Like I don't think that would work with the baker's wife. I think there still has to be like they don't hate each other, but you can see there's like maybe not like a deep love there either.
Yeah, I think they sort of like they definitely have a good partnership.
Yes,
to a certain extent, and like, you know, it comes into clarity and it takes two. But I think it's sort of like, it feels like they're almost more friends or just like working partners or like, you know, people who have just fallen into this rhythm of being in each other's lives, and maybe they're like kind of passive about it, which I think also makes Stephanie J. Block and Sebastian Arcellas, who are married in real life, when they play the roles, I think you can actually tell that they like, you know, have a love for each other. Yeah. And in the characters too, the way that they play them. And I think Sarah Bareilles and Brian Darcy James also played it like similarly, where it just felt like they were more concerned about each other. Like Joanna Gleason is a little bit like, oh, I can't believe you didn't remember the ingredients, and like I can't believe I have to like pick up after you and follow you around, and like it's just like it's a different type.
Yeah, it's a different type. I think it's totally appropriate to play it whatever way that you as an actor want to play it, what makes the most sense to you, because it works if they're deeply in love with each other. I think it does work if they're just a better partnership. I've now lived long enough where I've had friends who are divorced and in one case, like they're such a great partnership, and so they can continue to raise their kids. There's like no animosity there. It's just like they got to a point like there is no romantic spark between us, so let's make that break, still do what's right for the kids, and like be better as partners in that way, rather than like trying to force like a romantic relationship when that's just not there anymore. That would be an interesting approach to this show too, I guess. One last thing, I think you wanted to mention a little bit about the dialogue that's happening right before this song starts up.
I guess as a segue, like talking about the partnership between Baker and Baker's wife, some of the dialogue, you know, she meets Cinderella. She's like, oh my God, you're going to the festival. That's so cool. I think the way that the actor does the line reading of, she's like, oh, my husband somewhere in the woods, he's undoing a spell. Like, I think the line reading of that can actually sort of like display a lot about what the partnership between them is, because it's like, he's undoing a spell. Like, that's a really cool thing that he's doing that I'm helping him with. Or like, oh, well, he's just off somewhere undoing a spell. Like, who knows if it's like, you know, like, so I thought that was really interesting. And also, of course, her interaction with the prince, where she's just suddenly starstruck, like can't really
the deep bow
speak.
And,
like, just like doesn't even look at him. And then, you know, they do specify like, oh, the prince glances back at the baker's wife, like, you know, foreshadowing for later. But yeah, that was the main thing that I wanted to mention.
I think that's great. Yeah, a great call out, the different lyric choices. What's nice is, or different performance choices. This is like the one track like on every recording has different like stuff that they include like afterwards or before.
Yeah.
So it's like really up to the person who's producing this album of like how much of this scene they actually want to capture. But then their conversation kind of goes back and forth because the baker's wife discovers that Cinderella has been at the ball and wants to know like, you need to tell me about him. And so Cinderella says, he's a very nice prince, and it's a very nice ball, and when I entered they trumpeted, and the prince, yes, the prince, well, he's tall, is that all? Did you dance? Is he charming? They say that he's charming. We did nothing but dance.
He's a very nice prince, and it's a very nice ball, and when I entered they trumpeted. And the prince. Oh, the prince. Yes, the prince. Well, he's tall. Is that all? Did you dance? Is he charming? They say that he's charming. We did nothing but dance. Yes.
The way that Cinderella talks about this feels like every unmemorable first date that has ever occurred, you know?
Right.
It's like, oh, it's nice. Like, and what else? Like, oh, it was a nice place. Like, you know, that was, she just like has nothing to say about this. Which I just think is so funny.
No defining characteristics at all. Like, he's tall. Like, that's the only thing that we get as far as like his character.
And I think the way that they talk to each other is also interesting, where like sometimes Cinderella's like, wait, we're still talking? Like, why are we still having conversation? Whereas like if you watch the like really, really grainy bootleg of the Laura Benanti version on YouTube, I don't know if the baker's wife is actually younger, but she feels younger. Her voice is sounds younger. When you watch them talk, it feels more like girl talk. It's more like, oh, cool. Like, what's the gossip? You know?
Yeah.
And so I think that's also interesting how you can play that differently. But yeah, like Cinderella, again, doesn't care about the prince. And
no,
like,
not at all.
To be fair, like, why should she? Like, her wish wasn't to marry a prince.
I think
her wish was just to go to the festival. Yeah.
I think that's the key, right? It's like in this show, at the very least, her wish is just to go to the festival, which she's done. Like she got to do the thing she wanted to do. Yeah. So like her basically her arc for the wish at least is fully completed. The prince didn't really factor into that at all. So I think that's an interesting call out. I do want to give special shout out. This is maybe just because I have a deep love and appreciation for Laura Benanti. Was in the version of Gypsy that I saw many years ago.
Yeah.
Like I think that would technically have been my third Broadway show I ever saw.
Oh, man.
I loved her then, and she's still great now. But she has this unique ability. I guess many of the roles I've seen her in is to somehow find comedy in places I didn't even realize there could be a comedic beat. And like this seems like such a back and forth like standard scene, and yet she makes me laugh the way that she says "and" in some of these lines back and forth. I'm like, that's just the mark of a great actress.
Yeah. Also, this song was so weird to listen to before I had seen the show because I don't know if it's just the original cast album. They need to get it all on there. I feel like they don't give the "and" lines enough space to breathe. Yeah. So when you're first listening to it, if you don't know the lyrics, you're just like, and you're just like, what is happening?
Yeah.
So like this is really like an acting song. And
I agree.
It's like, if you look at the script, it like every line, it changes between sung, spoken. And it's just like so much of it is really just depending on how you want to play the characters.
I have no way of saying this is true or not, but just knowing that Sondheim very often asked for his collaborators to like write him a scene and then he would like musicalize it. I bet you anything this is such a Lapine thing where there's like a few things back and forth where it was like, and like question mark, like a lot of space. And Sondheim just took that and like, I can make a whole song out of like this.
They just yes-anded the whole song.
Exactly. Just trying to get some information out of her.
Cinderella did not do improv. That's a takeaway from this song.
Yeah.
She
just says no but. That's all she does.
Yeah. I think also, again, to talk about her and the prince, like, I think it's interesting that, like, the baker's wife, of course, enamored by this idea of the prince. But Cinderella also, if you try to look into her backstory, like, she has, like, almost no experience with men. Like, her probably only experience with men is with her father, who is, at this point, like, an alcoholic who's pretty neglectful.
Right.
And she doesn't really know. And it's, I think, implied that she's fairly young. This is like would be her first possible romantic entanglement. Why does she care? Like,
Yeah.
she's like, again, this is not what I wanted to do. And I think also another place where the line reading can be so different is on We Did Nothing But Dance. And it's like, that could be something she's excited about. That could be something she is not excited about. That could be something she's just like, oh, well, I only dance with this prince and no one else. And, you know, like that can just be played so many ways as well.
Absolutely. The other thing, at least this far into the song, there's been a couple of like rhymes here and there, ball, tall, and all, like, but actually I guess that's in the next section here. I just find it interesting that he actually does more so in the second half of the song, rhymes the first word of the line rather than the last word of the line, where you'll go like yes and guess, oh and no, like it's actually rhyming the first word sort of thing. So he's not really trying to make this like, I don't know, a rhythmically rhymed piece of music.
Yeah, it definitely is like very conversational. And also the part where it's like, is that all? Did you dance? Is he charming? It's mostly spoken, but like, you know, you can always do it kind of in rhythm, or you can have it actually posed with different questions. So yeah, the song is just so interesting in that aspect of like, it's like an actual dialogue that's just happens to be set to like a few notes 100%. And stuff. So yeah,
this is also one of those things too, like they talk about this during the prologue, but if you listen to the vamp underneath this, like, yeah, if you get off on this, like I would find it very hard to get back. Like, where am I? Especially if it was like a temp track that you're trying to sing to him. Like, if you get off of this, then you were totally boned, like to get back into where you're supposed to be.
Yeah. You better hope that you have a conductor and that conductor will bail you out of that water. One other thing about this section, I think it's funny when Cinderella's like, well, he's tall. And it's like, the baker's wife just saw him. Like, she knows. Like,
that's true.
He was right there. Like, so she really had no other things to say about the prince.
He had shoes. Like, okay, so the next part I'm going to sing is essentially, if you go and watch a version of Into the Woods now, would be the rest of the song. The song would end at this point, but we'll talk about how there's an extended version of the song on the original cast album. But the rest of the song would normally go this, with the baker's wife going, yes, and it made a nice change. No, the prince. Oh, the prince. Yes, the prince. He has charm for a prince, I guess. Guess. I don't meet a wide range. And it's all very strange.
And it made a nice change.
No, the prince.
Oh, the prince.
Yes, the prince.
He has charm for a prince, I guess.
Guess.
I don't meet a wide range, and it's all very strange.
Are you to return to the festival tomorrow eve?
Perhaps.
Oh, to be pursued by a prince! All that pursues me is tomorrow's bread. But I wouldn't.
Yeah, it's pretty strange.
Yes.
To borrow Cinderella's word, like I love the way that Kim Crosby does this song. Also, because you can see it very well on that recording, where she actually is when she goes back to saying he has charm for a prince, I guess, she's sort of like, you know, calling back to when the baker's wife was asking, is he charming? And you can see that she's sort of just trying to like maybe appease her by answering her questions. Like, okay, yeah, I guess like if you want to know more about the prince, I guess he's charming. And she doesn't really know like truly what else to say about the prince. Like, obviously she doesn't meet a wide range. She hasn't met like anyone outside of her house. That's why she wanted to go to the festival. So
this is such a great exploration of character, of like, you can really tell what each of them finds interesting, or like what they're keeping as top priority, just on how they're sort of like talking past each other, but you understand like what they're really asking at the same time. Just because it's so fresh in my mind. I recently just rewatched The Social Network, kind of randomly. But this is such an Aaron Sorkin thing. If you watch any of his stuff that he's made, of like, you have these two characters and they're usually speaking very fast, but you have these two characters who, like, one will ask a question, the other person will respond, not really directly to that question. Then there's another question asked, and then the second character will answer the first question, and then there's like a miscommunication that goes on, and it kind of just extrapolates from there. This feels like such like an Aaron Sorkin thing within this song, where it's like, I'm going back to your charming thing, even though that was asked like 3 or 4 statements ago. and we're kind of all looping back. And if you're in it, and if you're watching it, you understand what's going on. But the characters have to play as like, I'm confused. Like, where are we at? What's going on? What's happening?
Yeah, and Cinderella's still just like, she's thinking about herself and her own experiences. It made a nice change, like, oh, this is what's important to me, is that I don't have to be at home cleaning all day and picking lentils out of the ashes and stuff.
Right.
And like, that is the biggest part of the night for her, whereas the baker's wife is like, the prince is like a once in a lifetime opportunity. Also, actually, do you think that the baker's wife, if she weren't sent on this quest, would have been able to or wanted to go to the festival?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. That's actually, I guess my sense is that because it's happening at the palace, no, she wouldn't have been able to go. But then I don't really know, I guess, the socioeconomic station of bakers in whatever world this exists in.
Right. Maybe they could have catered the festival or something.
Maybe. I mean, yeah, they could have brought all the bread.
You know, honestly, that hadn't occurred to me because in a lot of the traditional retellings, it's always just like, oh, like everyone is invited, like every maiden, they're holding a ball to like, I guess she's not a maiden that is of like eligible, you know, but also that's not really specified in this one. Like, it seems like, oh, it's just a generic festival held by the king, technically. And then there happens to be a ball as part of this festival. So, you know, like, who knows? But I do find it interesting that, like, even though they're all in the same universe, none of the other characters ever mention the King's Festival. They barely mention the prince unless he's like immediately a topic of conversation. True. So yeah, it's not like, oh, there's gonna be people around because the king's, you know, like it's just only a Cinderella thing.
Yeah, it's a very that is a true thing. It's like no one else seems to care about the royal family besides Cinderella. Like I was mentioning here too, on the original Broadway cast, this song goes on for a little bit longer. And as Sondheim points out in his book here, it's like this extra length one really was never in the show. It may have gotten to previews. He just says it was cut for length eventually. So I don't know how far into the production it ever really got. Regardless, on the original Broadway cast, they go for a little bit longer. I'm going to break this up into two halves just so we can talk about it a little bit more effectively. So when Cinderella says, I don't mean a wide range, the baker's wife says, did he bow? Was he cold and polite? And Cinderella does say, and it's all very strange. But then the wife says, did you speak? Did he flirt? Could you tell right away he was royalty? Is he sensitive, clever, well-mannered, considerate, passionate, charming, as kind as he's handsome, as wise as he's rich? Is he everything you've ever wanted? What I know? Well, I know. But how can you know what you want till you get what you want and you see if you like it?
Did he bow? Was he cold and polite?
And it's all very strange.
Did you speak? Did he flirt? Could you tell right away he was royalty? Is he sensitive, clever, well-mannered, considerate, passionate, charming, as kind as he's handsome, as wise as he's rich? Is he everything you've ever wanted?
I know.
Well, I know.
But how can you know what you want till you get what you want and you see if you like it?
But I know.
Just to go in order, when she asked, was he cold and polite? That's such, those are two interesting characteristics for her to choose to ask off the bat, because they were basically the opposite of everything else she says about him. So I wonder where that came from.
Maybe, yeah, she's trying to get into it as like, is he just like a stuck up person, or is he actually like warm and like, is he a warm person, or is he a cold person? I guess it's just a way, it's a negative way to ask that question.
Right. And of course the whole list, sensitive, clever, well-mannered, considerate, passionate, charming, all that is the exact same as the list from Agony that the prince says about himself, which makes me think that it's like this big advertising campaign that he's done where he's like, meet the prince, he's sensitive, clever woman. Like, it's like a very specific list that is part of their PR team or something, you know?
Absolutely.
So I think as wise as he's rich is interesting, because the prince normally ends with an heir to a throne, and they're just like, actually, we don't really care about the throne, we just care that he's rich. So
yes, I know. Well, I mean, and those words are also the things she sings in It Takes Two, right?
Right.
You've become passionate, charming, considerate, clever, not rich, but she says.
Also, the prince is like, as we will find out throughout the show, basically none of these things.
Right. That's the other like little button on this, is that I guess he's handsome, but yeah, I wouldn't say
he's not kind.
Some of these other, and really, underscores that idea of like nice being different than something good. Like there is like that exploration here, which is why I'm just going to bring it up now. And maybe it's just because I've listened to it for so long, why I actually prefer this extension of this song, because I think it gives it an actual meaning rather than it just feeling like a conversation between two people, which is fine. It's nice. And it's like you can have a little bit of fun with that. But as far as like a song goes of trying to communicate an idea, I don't think that actually happens with the truncated version.
Yeah, that's true. I think it's like a very actory piece in the truncated version, but it's still just like it could have been a book scene, honestly. Like
that's what I mean. Like there's nothing that really screams for it to become a song.
Yeah. And here it's like you get the parallel between this and like this is obviously what the baker's wife is aspiring the prince to be. And then when she later brings that in for the baker, like, because this is, I think, the first time you would have heard it if you included this section. And then you hear her talk about it in regards to the baker, and it takes two. And it almost doesn't really work if you haven't heard it before, because why would that be the first time that it's mentioned in the show? Like, it feels agony does happen before it takes two. I got that mixed up in my mind. Okay, never mind. It still does kind of work, but like it is better when you have it.
Yeah, when
like
it says the 3 different times you've kind of heard this. And again, it just underscores, it's not that you don't hear some of this stuff, I guess, from Cinderella throughout, but I do like that she states very plainly, like, how can you know what you want until you get what you want and you see if you like it, right? Again, this speaks so much to that Cinderella character of having such a trouble making a decision, right?
Yeah.
Like, how can you make a goal? How can you make a wish if you've never tried it first and then see like, oh yeah, this is something that I actually want to pursue.
And I think the other thing is because she's from this pretty abusive household, like she's probably used to things going wrong and being punished for it. Like, and you even see that a little bit in the prologue. So if you make the wrong choice, it has sort of much larger implications for her than if you just don't make a choice and it's technically not your, when people talk about the trolley problem, like one of the options is just like, don't do anything because you're technically not making an active decision. I feel like that's kind of how she is approaching this. And that gets into steps of the palace later. If she doesn't know what her choices can lead to, then for her, maybe it's better to not make that choice. And if she has like a very limited worldview, it seems like the baker's wife is kind of like us, where she grew up with these stories of princes and like how they're sensitive, clever women, and etc. But Cinderella maybe hasn't heard that as much because she's been very like sheltered kind of, but also just like limited to her own experiences. So she is just like, why, like, how do you know?
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think if you don't know or have not been given the opportunity to have those experiences, and it's really hard to envision something totally new. Having been a Cinderella in a couple of times in my life, where you're stuck in something like, well, I know I don't want this. Like I know, like for her, like she doesn't want to be picking lentils out of the fireplace. She doesn't want to just be talking to birds all day long. But at the same time, it's like, but then I don't know what I want to switch or change into.
Right.
So sometimes it's easier just to stay where you are and not like what you do until to go into something completely unknown and be like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and being scared of the unknown.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I understand why this portion was cut for time. Like if you're really trying to find things, because all of these are illuminated on the steps of the palace. And I don't necessarily know that this gives you that much more for Cinderella to say it earlier as well, if you're already saying it later. So I wonder if like maybe this section was in it when they still had Back to the Palace, which doesn't quite elucidate that idea as much. And maybe that's why this was originally there. But I do think like the part with the baker's wife is definitely nice to have.
Give you those little leitmotifs that get sprinkled throughout the score.
Yeah. And the way that the baker's wife is just like, is he everything you ever wanted? Cinderella's probably not even thinking about that. She's not thinking about like, oh, what I want is a prince to marry. And but the baker's wife is like, she works for her life. Like she marries a baker, everything that's waiting for her is like tomorrow's bread and all that.
I think though this really then becomes apparent in Act 2, where she does get to have her little dalliance with a prince and kind of gets what she wants. But it does kind of call back to this extended version of the song that no longer is heard. I've had this thing now, and now I realize that that's not what I wanted in the first place. I thought that's what I wanted, but now that I've had it, that isn't actually what I want. What I wanted was this.
And Cinderella was right.
Yeah, Cinderella was right this entire time. This is how the song then ends in this extended version where the baker's wife goes, what I know, all I know is I never wish. What I want most of all, just within reason, is to know what I want. When you know you can't have what you want, where's the profit in wishing, is what the wife asks. And they both go, he's a very nice prince. And Cinderella finishes off with, and it's all very strange.
Have what you want. Where's the profit in wishing? He's a very nice prince.
So there's a lot of back and forth there, which I did not notate who is speaking, but I think the big ones here is like the baker's wife saying, I never wish. And then Cinderella saying, what I want most of all is to know what I want.
Mm-hmm. What do you think that means when she says, I never wish? I mean, she does follow it up with just within reason. So I think she means like she never thought she could ever be with a prince. Do you think she's referring to that? Or is it like that just seems a weird sentence to start because it's sort of a cutoff line. Like, what do you think the rest of that sentence was?
And I'd actually like to go back. I should have maybe like thumbed it through the prologue here again, just to see if she actually is, if she ever says, I wish.
She does say like,
opening
I
prologue.
want a child.
Yes.
I don't remember if she actually says, I wish, but maybe.
That I'd like to know if that's thematically the same throughout. To answer your question, I think she is such a practical person that she doesn't get into wishes. She's like, this is what I want, so I'm going to go out and I'm going to accomplish this thing. A prince would be so fun and stuff like that, but that's kind of just a fantasy, and she kind of understands it's a fantasy that it will probably never happen in her lifetime. So I think she is the person who's like, what's the point in wishing? There's only practical stuff that I can go after.
In the prologue, she does say, she has one of those like, just I wish without a follow-up. And later it's the baker that says, I wish we had a child. And the baker's wife says, I want a child. So I guess she's just like has generic wishes, but she won't necessarily verbalize them, maybe.
Yeah. Maybe she doesn't even know what she wants. Or maybe she doesn't even know what she wishes for.
Yeah. And when she says like just within reason, I guess like technically obviously like the prince is pursuing Cinderella through the woods. So Cinderella ending up with the prince is now within reason for her. But I wonder if that's maybe why she wasn't saying I wish in the prologue, because for her, a child like seemed out of reason, like if they'd been trying for so long and like it never happened, you know, like maybe she had given up by then. Like who knows, really? I
think there's so much rich stuff in there that you can kind of really like lean into as an actor.
Yeah. Also, back to what you were saying about her being practical, like when you know you can't have what you want, where's the profit in wishing? But that's like the opposite of what everyone else is doing.
A profit is such an interesting word. Isn't that?
That too,
profit is such a weird word to use.
Yeah, it's like, well, I mean, she was, again, the one that brought up as wise as he's rich. I think she just really doesn't want to be a peasant. So she is thinking about, that's top of mind for her.
I guess there's that too. I mean, again, we're living in this like fairy tale fantasy world where you can go and get these 4 items to make it be true that you can have a child. Yeah, this is where it is slightly pessimistic. It's like, listen, I live in this reality where I can't have a child, and that's my reality. Like when you know you can't have what you want, which is a kid, what's the profit in wishing? It's just wasted time for you to like focus on this. But now she's been given that opportunity to kind of go past that. I honestly think that the baker's wife textually is written as the person like, unless you're giving me like, do this and then this is the result. There's no point in like wasting time making up make-believe stories and then being disappointed in your life.
Yeah. And like, I think it's interesting because basically everyone else is just wishing for things that could, you know, like it's like, we know we can't have it, but that's the fun in wishing. And I was also wondering about Cinderella and her with her mom's tree, because, you know, we talked about how it seemed like the tree was just like, well, tell me what you want. Do you think that this is the first actual like physical wish that the tree has granted? Like, has she actually made wishes on the tree before? Was she just watering it with her tears before?
Yeah. But I mean, in the fairy tale, it absolutely is her just watering it with her tears.
Yeah. Because I see her as sort of someone who just like, you know, while she's spending the entire day cleaning and stuff, she's just sort of like, I wish this could happen. I wish that could happen. And she doesn't actually really expect any of it to be true. It's just sort of like idle daydreaming. And I think that sort of ties into the very end where Cinderella is the one that sings the last I wish. So it's And then that's opposed to like Jack's mom, who's just like, I wish a lot of things. Like my son was not a fool. The house was made of like gold, and those are very obviously things that like she can't really make happen. But she is practical about it in a different approach. She's like, yeah, I have wishes, but I'm not going to wait around for those to happen. I'm just going to have to deal with what I have.
This, then, no matter where it ends for you, this is, they have a quick little dialogue back and forth after this. But from memory, I remember then this is where, you hear the cow moo, you hear like Milky White run across the stage. And she's like, is that a beanstalk that's growing there in the distance? And then it's like, wait a second, are those shoes pure as gold? I need your shoes. And then she tries to run after Cinderella.
They're still talking past each other in that Aaron Sorkin way, basically.
That's right.
Like,
100%.
Will you look over there? An enormous vine growing next to that little cottage. I mean, slippers. It looks like a giant beanstalk rising into the sky. As pure as gold. I must get home. Wait! I need your shoes!
the other thing is, so I don't know if they just didn't specify in this, because I think Sondheim was the one that mentioned this in his book, that the whole midnight thing was a Charles Perrault idea of like, I need to be home by midnight, otherwise whatever. But when Cinderella says I must get home, what's the impetus for that? Like, oh, there's a beanstalk coming, like I have to go home now. Like, or is she just using that as an excuse to leave the conversation? Because midnight is not really a time crunch for her in this story.
That is true. That's actually a good question. I actually don't know. I don't know. I guess I assume it was just, her like, this is something strange is happening. It's probably best to go home and not be out in the woods at night, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because you're right in that even in this show, there's a time crunch as far as like the spell goes that they can cast. But for Cinderella, there really isn't. There's no reason she has to be home at a specific time. Mm-hmm. Right. She's not going to turn into a pumpkin or anything like that if midnight comes. Also,
I just thought it was really funny. If you look up, again, the really grainy video on YouTube of the Central Park production of this with Jessie Mueller as Cinderella, she's wearing like a short dress. Her shoes are clearly on display. I was like, I don't know how the baker's wife hasn't noticed her shoes until now, but that was like a little I had.
There is then a reprise of this song later on, which I find interesting is not included in any single recording of this show.
I was surprised about that too. I thought I was imagining this reprise until I pulled out the book and I was like, it's here. But like even the new Broadway cast album doesn't have it.
Does not include it.
Like
there's also the other Cinderella part that never gets included is basically the end of her story, right? Where the prince comes and the stepsisters try it on and all that kind of stuff.
Careful, my
which
toe.
I totally get for cutting from an album for time purposes and stuff like that back in the day. But for like a digital recording, I'm curious why they don't include it. Especially because there is like the reprise of like Cinderella at the grave, that melody, because her mother in the tree comes back and sings some stuff like that too. So anyways, there's all this stuff that gets cut from most recordings. But I did want to bring up the reprise of this song, which they meet on the second night. This is after the first agony happens, where we get a very nice Prince reprise, which always starts off with one of my favorite pratfalls, which is Cinderella having like falling.
It's funny the way that Philippa Sue did it on Broadway was because she had fallen the first night. And so she like steps up cautiously to where that step is on the stage and she looks at it and she like carefully steps down and she like looks really proud of herself for like not falling. And then she immediately falls. And I thought that was a great take on it too. Like there's just so many ways you can do it.
And then they do have a quick little back and forth here too. What did I write down here? I know that oh no, I didn't write it down. Never mind. Do you remember what it is that they say right before?
The baker's wife just says, well, she says like, you take plenty of spills, don't you? And she's like, oh, I recognize this girl. And she basically is trying to be like, I'd say those slippers are as pure as gold. And Cinderella's like kind of distracted. She's like, yeah, like they're great and whatever, but they're not very good for running through the woods because that's what she needs to do in them, I guess. And she's also like, they're not very good for dancing either. And again, they're just like talking two completely different tracks. And then the baker's wife asks, was the ball just as wonderful as last evening? And that's how we get into the song again.
Yeah, so here's how the whole thing goes here then, which is Cinderella answering, oh, it's still a nice ball, yes, and they have far too much food. No, the prince. Oh, the prince. Yes, the prince. If he knew who I really was. Oh, who? I'm afraid I was rude. Oh, how? Now I'm being pursued. Yes, and I'm not in the mood. So that's how the reprise goes.
Was the ball as wonderful as last evening? Oh, it's still a nice ball. Yes, and they have far too much food. No, the prince. Oh, the prince. Yes, the prince. If he knew who I really was. Oh, who? I'm afraid I was rude. Oh, how? Now I'm being pursued. Yes, and I'm not in the mood. He must have really taken a liking to you. I have no.
I think the baker's wife is the one that imposes the adjective of wonderful on the ball, and Cinderella's like, it's still nice. Like it's fine.
Yeah.
The far too much food, I think, is also just indicative of like what her lifestyle is used to, as opposed to what the prince's lifestyle is. And then if he knew who I really was. So this part bothered me in Stephen Sondheim's reasoning for it, because he talks about how, like, again, when he was like, why is Cinderella running from the prince? And this is sort of the reason he gives for why she's running from the prince. This had also bothered me since I first heard the show, where I was like, what is sort of Cinderella's sin? And by sin, I mean not in like the case of the 7 deadly sins, though that could be a whole podcast too of how those play into the show. But I mean, like, in the second act, the witch is like, oh, well, like, why did you need this? Why did you need to go to the festival? And I was like, what was wrong with her wanting to go to the festival? Like Little Red, you can say like it's gluttony, and like Jack got too greedy and like kept trying to steal things. The baker's wife does like pretty like kind of shitty things to like get a hold of the ingredients. Yeah. But I'm like, what did Cinderella do wrong? Based on the lyrics from the original Boom Crunch, she's just like, oh, well, you lied about who you were. I was like, did she though? Like, she came from a family that was well off enough to be able to go to the festival because her stepsisters went. And we never hear anything about her pretending to be someone else. Like when the prince sees her again as like the servant, he doesn't seem to have any issues with that. So I'm just like, I don't think this is a strong enough reason for me for why she was running from the prince.
This is kind of weirdly a running theme in Sondheim's work, because I have a similar criticism for the movie he wrote with Anthony Perkins, The Last of Sheila, which is a movie I like. But for those who haven't seen it, it's a murder mystery, but these I forget, it's like 6 or 7, actually these 5 people are invited onto a boat, and each of them are confronted by the thing that they most want to keep secret. And I feel within the movie, all of those secrets are put onto the same level, except I think one is like so far away awful, and the other ones are like, yeah, okay, like, sure, I understand why you wouldn't want this to be revealed or something like that to like your wife or this person. But one is like, you would be going to prison if this is revealed. These are not on the same level to me. And it's kind of the same thing here, which is like, you understand where the other people, like you say, we're greedy or gluttonous or all this thing. And Cinderella, it doesn't really fall into this, the same idea. Yeah. Right. Like she's had a hard life with like bad parents, bad step parents. Yeah. And now like a witch blaming her for something that's like, well, like, I don't know. She is still of royalty. She's still of like higher class, just like forced not to be.
Right. And I think like on the steps of the palace gives like a perfectly good reason for why she isn't just running off with a prince, where she's just not used to making decisions and she doesn't want to make the wrong decision and like regret it. And, like, what if I'm not what he wants? And, like, I understand that anxiety for like, oh, that explains a lot about why she didn't just run off with a prince. And I don't think it actually has to do with like, oh, I'm lying to him. Like, I think I do not a real reason.
I will say, I guess, I do understand to a certain extent, maybe her reason of like, hey, this is like this very wealthy, well-to-do man, and I'm just a scullery maid. So there'd be no reason outside of him seeing me in this gown why he would ever fall for me, sort of thing.
I mean,
so
I guess I think it's part of it, but I think if Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine are like hanging that as the only reason that she is not going to the palace, like, I don't buy it completely. Like,
I get that.
Yeah. Anyway, but she's like, if he knew who I really was, and the baker's wife seems suddenly interested. She's like, oh my God, is she another celebrity?
Who are you? Who are you?
I think that's always so funny.
Honestly, I think it's like 90% that she talks to birds. That's who she really is, and people, it's weird. It's a weird quirk.
Well, That's the other thing I find so fascinating about this show is like just the presence of magic and like where it does and doesn't exist. Like, you know, the famous line of like, oh, the witch from next door. Like, that's very casual. Like, you know, we just happen to be living next to a witch. And that's why it's such a funny line when Little Red is like, you talk to birds, because we're just like, we've accepted it because we're like, we're in fairy tale land, but obviously it's not a huge thing for other people there. And it's just so funny.
Meanwhile, just to point out, she's talking to wolves. So, I mean, I don't know if she has the right to judge people.
Yeah. And then, like, Jack is speaking to Milky White. Is Milky White speaking back to him? We don't know. The audience doesn't talk to cows. Like, who knows?
Oh, I forgot to ask, that first Fiasco one version that you went to see, how was Milky White shown?
It was, so the way that they did it, it was also different orchestrations. It was like an actor muso production where they had one pianist at like an upright piano that was getting wheeled around the stage. They had no narrator. It was like different people would stand in for the narrator at different times. And then the actors would also play some of the other instruments. So it was a stripped down orchestration.
Yeah.
But the pianist would stand in for Milky White. He would just like put on a cowbell around his neck and be like, moo. Right. And that was pretty funny too. They had a lot of doubling in that production. So, like, I think Rapunzel also played Little Red. The princes played the stepsisters, which was very funny, and like stuff like that. It was a really cool production.
Oh, cool.
But yeah,
someone just sent me an email with like video and photos. I want to say it was the new Fiasco version. Anyways, Milky White, he's on like a unicycle, big unicycle with like a cow head, and he like wheels around the stage and stuff like that. Anyways, this goes to my point. Is like Milky White is always done in a very different way in every single production.
There's like a whole Tumblr. I don't know if it's still being updated, but it was just low budget Milky Whites was like the name of the Tumblr. And it's great. Oh, also, just since I didn't mention earlier, the Fiasco production actually does use the cut verse from A Very Nice Prince. There's a clip of it on YouTube as well of their just that song, so you can see it done.
So I guess as we're kind of getting to the end here, was there any other things you wanted to bring up about this song?
So there was a little bit of dialogue after the reprise as well. Well, also when Cinderella says, "I'm not in the mood," I think it's kind of funny how depending on the character that sings it, it could either be directed towards the baker's wife or towards the prince. Yeah, like, true. I'm not in the mood to keep talking about this, or just like, I'm not in the mood to be pursued through the woods. I think that is like a smart thing. But the dialogue after that is Cinderella says, "I've no experience with princes and castles and gowns." And the baker's wife says, "Nonsense, every girl dreams." And I mean, it's the same point we've been making this whole time, but Cinderella is just like, this is not the part that I wanted. And the baker's wife is like, of course it is. Like, why wouldn't it be? This is what everyone wants. And so I think it just like, you know, it sort of shows each of their selfishness. Yeah. How each of them are selfish in a certain way. Whereas like the baker's wife is like only thinking about herself and just assuming that everyone else has the same dreams and everything as she does. And Cinderella is just like, well, this isn't something that I'm used to. Like, I'm uncomfortable with this now. Like, I don't want to be here anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things where I sometimes notice when people say, well, every single person does this or everyone thinks this. Like, what you're really saying is that you think this or you want this rather than everyone.
Yeah, it's tough to talk in absolutes.
If we were forced to, and we had to like rate this song in the whole entirety of the score, do you think this would show up in your top 3, middle 3, or bottom 3?
I think it would be, as a song that I just want to listen to, I think it would be like top of the bottom or bottom of the middle. But I think dramaturgically, it would maybe be higher up, just because I like, you know, we've talked about how many different acting choices you can make with this and just how like interesting it is to have these two characters who are basically opposites talk to each other. But yeah, like it's a tough song to listen to just because it's basically conversation set to tune.
Yeah, it's just kind of going back and forth. There's not really even much of a melody that I would say that goes into this. Like there is melody, but I mean that's not what I come away from this song like really thinking about. It's like what they're communicating back and forth with one another, and the acting choices more than the actual song itself. So yeah.
I think the interesting part about this song is that Cinderella basically has the same underscoring through all 3 of her songs in the first act, where it's like the first one, the reprise, and also Steps of the Palace. It's like the same piano arpeggios going through it, like she's not really changing. And it's all just like it feels very stream of consciousness. Like that's how she talks. So I think like it's also important in that regard. But yeah, like there's not really a real melody.
This season I am like keeping a list as we go through this. So I'm kind of like you, like it's not like I hate this or anything. And you're right, like during the show, I have such a fun time with this song, the way that it's being performed. But yeah, if I was going to listen to something, it's probably never going to be my first choice. So it's probably going to be near the bottom of my list. It's going to enter in basically 3 from the bottom.
Okay.
So I'm putting it above I Guess This Is Goodbye and Cinderella at the Grave. We'll see where that goes as we continue
I
on.
am actually a Cinderella at the Grave fan.
There you go.
Like I think it's just like it's short enough that I'm just like I won't skip it. And also I just think that the orchestration is beautiful in that, and like the way that they do the mother is always like slightly ethereal. I think that actually is more fun to listen to than this. But to each their own.
Maybe this is my bias against Cinderella showing up. It's
actually though.
Well, where are we at here in my document? Christine, thank you so much for... Oh, actually, no. There's one last question I have to ask you here, too, which is the question that I'm asking every single person this season, which is, what is your favorite fairy tale?
Oh, man. I mean, of the, like, Disney movies, I loved both Little Mermaid and Sleeping Beauty. But then, like, just reading fairy tales, I thought Rumpelstiltskin was like weirdly creepy and like, but also kind of cool because the princess, I forget what she is, actually like gets to do something where she's like, I'm going to figure out this guy's name that he is just saying to the public.
Yeah, Rumpelstiltskin is such a fun one. I mentioned this when we were talking about Little Red, where I'm like, I'm surprised that Disney has never made a feature length Little Red Riding Hood film yet. Like it seems like one of the classic ones that they would have done by now. But Rumpelstiltskin is another one where they probably wouldn't. Well, maybe they would keep the same name, but nowadays they usually do like a one word, like it's Frozen or Tangled. They wouldn't actually call it the name, so they probably call it something else. But it has such a great like beginning, middle, and end that is like this feels like it could be made into a full length movie pretty easily.
Right. Well, were you familiar with the she's a young adult writer, Donna Jo Napoli?
I don't know. What has she written?
She so she does a lot of sort of basically like retellings of fairy tales. One that I read was Bound, which was her retelling of Cinderella, but like in the Chinese tradition. So Bound was referring to like the feet binding and stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
And then another one was Zell, which was Rapunzel, but like she was known as Zell. So she does sort of those like that just reminded me when you said like one word titles and stuff like that are like sort of referring to it, but not quite. Which also actually, speaking of young adult fairy tale novels, one of the ones that I really enjoy this fairy tale now too is the 12 Dancing Princesses, also because the girls are just like try to party at the dad's like no. But there's another novel based off that which I thought was really cool as a teenager called Entwined, so if anyone's interested, that I thought was really well done.
Christine, thank you so much for joining us here today. This was really fun. If people wanted to stay in contact with you, see what you're up to, what's the easiest way to do so online?
So the easiest is probably Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it. I'm Across the Arch. Yeah, you can contact me on there. I also do a Broadway podcast normally in the like January to June season of current new musicals for every Broadway season, and that is Bottomless Broadway, which you can also look up on any other podcast platform that you wish to use.
Perfect. Great. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
That's not soft shoe. That's heavy metal.
Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter or Instagram. This is an independent production, and you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you can get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about First Midnight, and we'll be spending at least 30 minutes on Slotted Spoons. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.
No matter how.
Yeah! No matter who.
Hey! No matter where.
One thing is true.
I'm with you.